Mishnah in the 10th chapter is investigating the status of a woman who is just reached maturity and is passing out of her father's house into her husband's house. So, in other words, she's leaving the domain of her father and entering the domain of her husband. And as she crosses that barrier, her vows become revocable by her husband rather than by her father. And we've already said that while she's in this gray zone, so if she's a na'ara, that's between 12 and 12 and a half years, but she's also betrothed, actually both the husband and the father need to speak up in order to revoke a vow. But the Mishnah, as it jumps into as we jump into the fourth Mishnah, we're going to look more at the boundary point, and the Mishnah observes, Derech Talmidei Chachamim. It was the practice of Talmidei Chachamim, or scholars, or wise people. Ad shelo hayta bito yotza me'etzlo, before their daughters departed from their house. So in other words, it was normal practice among scholars when they were marrying off their daughters. Omer, he'd say to her, Kol Nedarim shenadart b'toch beiti harehen mufarim. All the vows which you vowed in my house are annulled. In other words, he'd send her off effectively with a clean sheet. And I think this may reflect the general rabbinic unease with vows in general. Vows are dangerous things, and they can get you into trouble, and you don't want to send your daughter off to someone else's domain, kind of saddled with these vows. And it seems to go the other way too. B'chein habal, similarly the husband. Ad shelo tikanes li'rushuto, similarly the husband, before she entered into his domain, Omer, I would say to her, Kol nedarim shenadart ad shelo tikanes li'rushuti hare elu mufarin. All the vows that you vowed before you entered my domain are annulled. Because once she entered into his domain, he can't annul them. So he could, once she's entered into his domain, he could annul vows that he heard if she was his wife, but he couldn't annul vows that had been taken before she entered his domain. So we're going to emphasize that division point. And then we're going to ask, well, what happens if this girl reaches majority, Bulgarian, sheshahat, 12 chodesh, ve'almana 30 yom, someone who reached the age of majority. And the Mishnah says, sheshahat 12 chodesh, who waited 12 months. So we're still in this gray zone between the father and the husband, but we don't quite understand what this is. And we need to go back to the Mishnah in Ketubot to understand it. So you remember in Ketubot, we learned, a virgin's given 12 months from when the husband asked for her to prepare herself. This is someone who's betrothed. She's betrothed, but there's no date on the marriage. And in those days, there was a long waiting time between betrothal and marriage, because the husband had to raise funds in order to create a household. It wasn't as simple. Today we collapse betrothal and marriage, but in those days they were extended. And there would come a point when the husband would come back and say, look, I'm ready to marry now. I've got the money to marry. I can bring you into my house. And at that point, she has 12 months to sort of get her trousseau together, to get herself ready, to get herself psychologically ready. And by the way, the man gets it too. Not namely to get herself together. And just as it's given to the woman, it's given to the man to prepare himself. And for a widow, 30 days. So let's just keep that in mind. And we can remember, now we sort of understand When the Mishnah says Bulgarish is Shahat Shneimasa Chodesh, we're talking about a girl who's reached majority. She's a Bulgarian, she's 12 and a half, and she's waited 12 months. Or the widow 30 days. And the halacha is, let's just go back to the Mishnah in Ketubot. The halacha is that her husband has to support her if those 12 months passes and that she's not married. If the 12 months comes to the end and they're not married. By the way, or shemetu balehen, we hope this doesn't happen, all the husband dies. They eat from his possessions and they can eat from it. In other words, from that 12 months, they become the husband's responsibility to feed. So the question that Mishnah is now going to be interested in the Nedarim is, look, if they're the husband's responsibility to feed in advance of the wedding, can the husband annul their vows? Or are we back to the situation we learned at the beginning of the Mishnah when annulling the vow is a joint responsibility, both of the husband and of the father? And we'll see a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages. Bulgarish is Shahat Shneimasa Chodesh. So a girl who's reached majority, she's waited 12 months. So she's now being supported by her future husband. And a widow 30 days. Same situation. They're both being supported by their future husband. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hoil Uvala Chayav B'Bnoteihem Yafer. Rabbi Eliezer says, since her husband is responsible for her maintenance, he can annul. There's a connection between the financial responsibility and, if you like, the legal responsibility. And the sages don't agree. V'chachamim omrim, ein habal mefer ad shetikanes liyushuto. And we have a verse, we looked at a verse yesterday, there's a verse from the Torah that says the husband can annul, but only when he is really her husband, not when he's betrothed.